Brian Goldsmith, what the hell is happening in California?
That's kind of an evergreen question, isn't it, Katie?
But there's a recall going on today, and Governor Newsom, I guess, is his career is on the line a bit.
It is. I mean, if he loses, he's in really bad shape, but I don't think that's going to happen. The polling overwhelmingly shows him with a big advantage. We all have the 2016 PTSD, where people assured us over and over again that Donald Trump could not be elected, and yet that happened. So, we'll see what actually transpires. But I would be very, very surprised if he didn't win big, actually.
What is the genesis of this recall, Brian?
Well, it's interesting. It started like a lot of recall efforts in California do, with basically just the political opposition that didn't like Gavin for a whole host of ideological reasons. And then it gained steam with the COVID restrictions that he put in place to try to handle the virus, which were broadly popular at the beginning, but very unpopular with a particular group, especially small business people, other kind of core Republican constituencies in the state. But it was sort of petering out until a few things happened. One was COVID got dramatically worse. And so Gavin's numbers took a hit when it didn't look like all of these measures were really worth it. Number two, Gavin had a dinner in violation of his own rules at the fanciest restaurant in California, which is called the French Laundry. Lovely restaurant, but he shouldn't have been there. Number three, national Republican money came in to fund the signature gathering. That's really important. People think that these signatures just end up on petitions organically. There's some of that, but most of the time it's paid signature gatherers going and harvesting signatures. And I would say finally what happened is a judge extended the deadline for the recall proponents to hit the number of signatures that were required. Even with all the other factors I described, this thing was going to die without that deadline extension. And so basically a perfect storm came together to enable this to get on the ballot in a state where it is easier to get a recall on a ballot than any other. The only successful recall that ever happened in 2003, when you had a few things transpire simultaneously. You had an energy crisis where literally the lights went out in huge parts of California. You had an economic slowdown. You had a deeply unpopular governor in Gray Davis with approval ratings that were basically half of Gavin Newsom's approval ratings today. And you had a state that was about 15 points less Democratic than it is today. I mean, it's important to remember in 2000, which was the last presidential election before the 2003 recall, Gore beat Bush in California by 12 points. In 2020, the last presidential election before this recall, Biden beat Trump by almost 30 points. So the landscape for a Republican, the landscape for an anti-democratic initiative is far different today than it was then.
What's different for this recall? One is that in 2003, Arnold Schwarzenegger was on the ballot and he had very high name recognition. That's not really the case this go round, is it?
Yeah, Arnold was very funny about this. He was just interviewed about it and he was asked to say his name at the top of the interview. And of course, that's like ridiculous. Everybody knows who he is. And he said, yeah, hi, I'm Governor Schwarzenschnitzel. It's nice to meet you all. But Arnold was one of a kind, obviously. He transcended politics. He was a bigger than life, universally identifiable action hero. And Latino Democrats were as enthusiastic about Arnold as a lot of core Republican constituencies. And so you had, to your point, Katie, an alternative that was not just acceptable, but also exciting for a lot of California voters.
Who is this Larry Elder guy who is apparently leading in the group of opposing candidates?
Well, let's talk about how this works, and then I'll answer your question. So okay. There are two questions on the ballot. Question one is, should the governor be recalled? And if 50% plus one of the voters say yes, he is recalled. Question two is, if he is recalled, who should replace him. And the plurality of the voters, the candidate who gets the most votes, even if it's only 15%, 18%, if the first question is passed, that person, even with only 15 or 18%, he becomes governor. And so you could have a situation where, in effect, Gavin gets 49% of the vote and is booted from office, and Larry Elder gets 18% and succeeds him as governor. Now, who is Larry Elder? Larry Elder is a Black conservative talk show host who has a big following among a lot of California Republicans. He's famous among that kind of universe of people. He's been on talk radio for a very long time in this state. So he came, onto the scene with some real name ID. But he's kind of the gift that keeps on giving for Gavin, because he's not a broadly acceptable figure. And so Gavin has been able to sort of make the election not just about Trump versus the Democrats, but about Larry Elder versus Gavin Newsom, and on a whole host of issue positions, from COVID controls to choice, to Larry Elder's troubled relations in the past with some women, to the minimum wage. Elder has seemed out of step with where the majority of Californians are.
The number of people who mail in their ballots is critically important. The fear was that a lot of anti-Newsom voters would participate in this recall and pro-Newsom voters wouldn't. Has that equation changed in recent weeks?
Yes, it has. And that was the fear. Who's motivated? The people who want to kick him out. Who's not motivated? The people who think, maybe he's doing a mediocre job, but I'm not sure. I'm busy. Do I want to deal with this thing? But that's shifted dramatically in recent weeks by the Newsom team having the resources to advertise this election as a choice rather than a referendum.
What's the biggest lesson here for Gavin Newsom if he isn't recalled?
Well, I think it depends to a great extent on what the results are. If he wins big, if he has a double-digit margin of victory, he may just take away from this. This was a rump group of embittered Republicans who managed to sneak this thing onto the ballot, and I crushed them. I'm great, they suck, move on. If it's close, I can't really get inside Gavin's head, but he may start to reassess how he handles his governorship, reaching out more to conservative parts of the state, trying to be more of a bridge builder. But I think, a lot of this has to do with the stringent measures he put in place to try to contain COVID. And I really don't think he regrets those. I mean, I think he knew when he did it that there was going to be a big backlash among the businesses that were affected. So interestingly, he's up for re-election next year. And the first round is in June of 2022. The irony for Newsom is if he beats this thing handily, which I actually expect him to, it could strengthen him politically, because a lot of people may decide not to run against him a few months from now, thinking he can't be beaten.
Do you think he'll still run for president one day?
Well, yes, he does have presidential aspirations. I don't know how anyone with that head of hair couldn't, who happens to be governor of California. My friend Mike Murphy has this theory that, if he beats this thing handily, if he's reelected easily, he could theoretically, if Biden chooses not to run for reelection, test the waters against his old frenemy from California, Kamala Harris, who has political challenges of her own.
Brian Goldsmith. Thank you, Brian, my little political wonk.
My pleasure.
Friend.
Anytime.
And this is why, ladies and gentlemen, Brian was grounded when he snuck out of his bedroom in high school to watch C-SPAN. That's right.
I never turned down a payday like this. Thank you, Katie.